Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the 2018 Aurora Dialogues in this beautiful city of Yerevan. I'm Jane Corbin, and for 30 years I've been an international broadcaster for the BBC, reporting on some of the most intractable conflicts and humanitarian crises around the world. This year, a year when the world is embroiled in so many crises, the theme of the Aurora Dialogues is Inspire, Empower, and Impact. And our goal today is to discuss pressing issues, but also to find practical ways to bring about change. Now, through the day, you can tweet using the hashtag Aurora Dialogues, and the live feed will be displayed on these screens. And if you need translation, the number for the language that you want, the channel, is on the back of the handsets by your seat. And most importantly, the Wi-Fi is Aurora Prize 2018, and you don't need a password. Now, the Aurora Dialogues are part of the Aurora Humanitarian initiative, founded by 3 Armenian philanthropists, Nubar Afeyan, Vartan Gregorian, and Ruben Vardanyan. Their vision is to support individuals and promote global projects targeting the world's most helpless and destitute people. Now, you'll be hearing from all of them today, but here to get us off to a flying start is one of those co-founders and president of the Carnegie Corporation of New York. Please welcome Vartan Gregorian.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I'm here today to make introductory remarks, but first one has to be about this institution, Madena Daran, where you're here. Some of you have come frequently here, some of you have never been here, and some of you came and could not return because you got captivated by the knowledge here and got stuck for the rest of your life. Madena Daran, of all the countries that you visited in Europe and Asia, most nations brag about the tallest building, fastest, most beautiful river, architecture, gardens. Armenians stuck themselves with the fate of the book. This is the house of the book. As you know, Islam in its Quran and others has Ahlul Kitab, people of the book. Well, Armenians are people of the book in a different sense, not because they're Christian or Jewish or other, but rather they're lovers of the book. Book has been the memory of mankind, and for Armenians has been memory of Armenian nation. That's why in this place you have the most peaceful coexistence of Arabs, Jews, Iranians, Arabs again, Indians, Mongols, Tatars, Byzantium, Roman Empire, Arab Empire. Whoever has come dominated this region, dominated Armenians. Armenians felt their duty to protect their manuscripts. Not Armenian manuscripts, but their manuscripts as well. So if you have a chance to look at the card catalog here, you'll find that Hebrew, Greek, Roman, Arabic, Persian, Turkish, all of these volumes coexist peacefully without bothering each other. They tolerate each other, they accept each other, because knowledge has no frontiers. Forgive me, Dr. Kushner. Knowledge has no frontiers. Books have no frontiers. In many ways, this library represents best about Armenians. Of all the buildings in this city, this is the most revered building of all, because the entire repository of Armenian treasures are here, and they don't discriminate against any of the traditions. Having said this, also let me mention the fact that next 2 days I'll be discussing also 3 great strengths of Armenians. One has been the fact that they develop their own alphabet, 401. They translated the Bible into Armenian, even though they were able to read Assyrian and Greek and later Latin, because they nationalized Christianity by being the first nation to accept Christianity 301 AD, 11 years before King Constantine, Emperor Constantine declared Christianity as a religion tolerated cult or religion in this case. So why are we here today? Because we would like to transcend, like this library, our parochialism, to be part of the universal. I've mentioned this before, Platonic and Socrates, Plato and Aristotle divisions. One is particular, one is universal, the other is particular, but it did not prohibit particular to participate in universal without dissolving itself in the universal. So Armenians have kept their national identity, but participate in universal norms. And that's one of the reasons why we're here also, to see to what extent what we're doing has universal impact. We could be satisfied to have Aurora here, celebrate, welcome, eat several times a day, and then be happy. But that's not the purpose of Aurora. Aurora wants to reach out, to remind people everywhere that conscience still matters, values still matters, humanity still matters, dignity still matters, that we're all creatures of the same God. If you're not a believer, we're all creatures of the same humanity. As a result, with that comes great responsibility. Aurora, after a century, after Armenian genocide, is not here to bemoan, condemn, but rather explore, go beyond, and to appeal to all the survivors of the genocide here and elsewhere to think ahead, that you have survived. By survival comes responsibility. With responsibility comes action, not just words, because words are empty without action. And that's what Aurora is trying to do, not to confine itself to Armenia, but to go beyond Europe, eventually Asia, Africa. We already are there, thanks to our laureates. To go beyond, to remind humanity that the small republic, small nation, this nation, devastated during World War I, has at long last returned, but returned not to condemn, returned to serve, returned to be and become. And these sessions that we have, dialogue, is exactly that, because we don't claim to be, at least three of us co-founders, we don't believe that we're the guardians, sole guardians of virtue, embodiment of virtue and knowledge. But rather, there are many people of goodwill in Africa, in Asia, in Europe, even Antarctica, everywhere. They need opportunity not to be isolated, to feel they're part of something, part that matters. So we're not a great nation in terms of size, but we like to remind great nations that with greatness, with power comes responsibility. And that's why we're happy to join various organizations through this dialogue, bring here the kind of list you have here, all of you prominent people who are listed here, to bring here, but not to wait for you to come here, to go to you also, whether it's in Berlin, whether it's London, whether it's New York, in order to form bonds amongst those of us who believe that we have witness. We're not Jehovah's Witnesses alone, witnessing for God. We are human representatives, humanities, social sciences, universal norms, witnessing for humanity's values, and we need this to be partnerships in order to be effective. This is not a one-time light of a lighthouse coming and then followed by prolonged periods of darkness. We like that line to shine through this library, shine through you and laureates who are here, and all the prominent jury members and others who are guiding us in this effort. So I'd like to thank all nominees who are here, to thank jury members who are here, speakers who are here, that in strength lies in unity, and unity lies in honesty, and it honestly lies on virtue, and not facts, but distilled facts, so that they're true in essence and meaning and not forms of manipulation. With that, I'd like to thank all of you for coming, and I hope you will have a productive day, exchanging views, changing minds, or instilling doubts in minds, or forming alliances after one has realized what their true essence and values are. Because I've mentioned in the past, we are not created to be socioeconomic entertainment units. We are spiritual beings with a quest of universals, values, and what gives meaning to life, not now, but throughout our existence. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you very much, Vartan. Now, our first speaker today really needs no introduction. For 4 years, Samantha Power served as US ambassador to the UN, as well as being a member of President Obama's cabinet. He has called her one of our foremost thinkers on foreign policy. A former journalist, an author, a Harvard professor, and a mother, she's been named as one of Time's 100 most influential people, recognized as a leading voice internationally for principled American engagement in the world. Welcome to Ambassador Power.
Thank you.
So, Samantha, with all the things you've done and with your rich array of experience, what has drawn you to the Aurora Prize and the time that you give to the selection committee? What is it about Aurora?
Well, let me say I'm very humbled to be here among the nominees and among the founders of this organization and among the various heads of state and Nobel Prize winners who sit on the selection committee. It's just looking out at the audience, it's an incredible roster of people who have dedicated their lives for the cause of others and for human dignity, as Vartan just described. For me, I suppose the seed was planted when I came very innocently to the history of the Armenian genocide. I set out to write a book on American responses to the major genocides of the 20th century, and as I dug into the creation of the word genocide, which didn't occur until the middle of the Second World War, I realized, as anybody who studies the history and the records would, that actually the word genocide came about in large part because of the destruction of the Armenians. Raphael Lemkin, himself, who lost 49 members of his family in the Holocaust, was trying to find a word that would capture the gravity of a crime where perpetrators set out to destroy, in whole or in substantial part, an ethnic, religious, or national group. And one of the cases that he dug into, and that really inspired him, was what would become known as the Armenian genocide, or what should become known in certain quarters as the Armenian genocide. So, as I dug into that history, that's what introduced me to Armenia and the horror of what had happened in the early part of the 20th century. But along the way, I also encountered a group of individuals who time and again were risking either their careers or their lives to try to stop genocide, including Americans who were posted in the Ottoman Empire and sending blistering cables back to Washington describing the wholesale slaughter of the Armenian people, like Henry Morgenthau most famously. And I came to refer to this set of individuals, who I think are embodied in this year's nominees, as not bystanders, which is what we're all familiar with, but upstanders. Mm-hmm. And then suddenly Ruben Nubar came to see me in my office when I was UN ambassador, and they said, we have this idea, we want to valorize upstanders. We want to celebrate those kinds of individuals who, through the course of human history, have risked everything dear to them for their fellow men and women. And I said, this is incredible that you're going to do this, and that, where all of the incentives are often to duck and to put your head down and, stay close to your family and just protect what's absolutely nearest and dearest to you, you're opening up the aperture and celebrating individuals who deserve to be celebrated, and maybe in so doing you offer some modest protection for them and a platform for their voices to be heard in even more places than they otherwise would be. So that's the inspiration. I can't believe this prize exists, and that these three individuals have harnessed the pain of what was done to their predecessors, to Armenians, and then turned it into something so globally constructive.
And of course, you have written about genocide in your book. And looking ahead, what do you think government agencies and others can do at this moment, when obviously we have situations like that in Myanmar with the Rohingya? What can be done to avert such terrible things in the future?
Well, I think for starters, right now, I think in my adult lifetime, I've never seen a period where there is so little diplomacy being done. And I have to say, we did a lot of diplomacy as the Obama administration. A lot of it didn't succeed. See the war in Syria and the horrific carnage there. But by the end of our administration, John Kerry was practically collapsing of exhaustion. So tireless was he. And if you look at conflict and displacement, particularly, conflicts now are lasting, 2, 3, 4 times the length of how long conflicts lasted in the 1970s, 80s, even the 90s, which were difficult
the Syrian
years.
war is longer than the Second World War right now.
Really, and so people are staying displaced across borders as refugees. There's a reason we have the largest displaced population since the Second World War. It's that the root causes of displacement are not being addressed. So I think we need a diplomatic surge of the kind that I think is frankly missing. But the other thing, if I may, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday, and I think the nominees really embody this, we need to put faces on crises. People are so overwhelmed right now by the scale of suffering and tragedy. They're not even people who would like to give money or who want to activate. They just, it's almost like a system shutdown. When I was ambassador, we dealt with something very similar to this in the face of the Ebola crisis, where we were looking at charts that said that 1.4 million people were going to be infected with Ebola within 4 months because of the exponential spread of the disease. And we had lovely and well-meaning and life-saving UN diplomats who were coming to the heads of state and to the countries of the world, and they were reading these statistics in a very clinical, frankly, almost sanitized way. And we happen to be president of the Security Council, and one idea I had is, why don't we, instead of having another lifeless conversation about the largest calamity and emergency of that moment, why don't we see if we can get a video link to one of these MSF clinics in Liberia that is having to turn away patients, parents who are carrying their Ebola-infected children and having to leave them at the doorstep of these clinics because there aren't beds, because again, the international community at that point was doing almost nothing. And so we had this young Liberian guy who was not terribly well educated. He was just a worker at this clinic, and he was up on the screen in the famous Security Council chamber, and he just said, he described a father who had just been there who dropped his daughter, couldn't get the daughter into the clinic, wept, and then got back in a taxi, and having carried his daughter, that meant he was going to be infecting the entire family that he was going back to, or that she had probably already done that. And he just, again, on this big screen with all of these people who are used to being desensitized, he said, people, if you do not help, I have to tell you, we will all be wiped out. We will all be wiped out. And his kind of broken English, and you could hear a pin drop. And it's not that changed the world, it just meant that each of the individuals who were touched by him and by the humanity of what he was going through and having to make these decisions of who lives and who dies and who gets quarantined or, cared for properly and who doesn't, each of the individuals who were in an audience like this one became advocates with their own governments. And so I think there's a lesson in that, right, of taking the big and bad and overwhelming and rendering it in terms that each of us can understand, because we can each imagine being a parent and that sense of desperation, or being him and having to play God in that way.
Well, you talk about the lack of diplomacy now at the UN level, at the level of several governments, and you talked then about enablers doing things, using the Ebola example. So if there is a lack of diplomacy and action at the highest levels, what can be done at the grassroots levels to really, really change things?
Well, I think, each of us, and I suffer from this, as I'm sure everyone in this room does, has to not be paralyzed by the fact that we can't solve these big structural problems all at once. There's, you know, when you have 67 million people displaced, when you have what some have called an autocracy cascade, you know, of, you know, quasi-authoritarian tendencies by an American president, along with an emperor for life in China, along with, illiberal and anti-human rights actions even by what we had thought were core members of the European Union. That's a pretty depressing time to be thinking about making a difference in the world. But I guess what I always try to think to myself is, chances are there's always something one can do. And even if it's like in the United States, caring for looking around and looking for the refugees who are coming into the US. There are very few refugees now being allowed into the US, very much unlike the US response to the Armenian genocide, which was one of the most generous, I think the grassroots response to the Armenian genocide at the time and its immediate aftermath was the equivalent of $4 billion in today's dollars. You're the President of the United States telling Americans to use their Saturdays and Sundays and their church meetings to raise money for Armenian orphans and refugees. Okay, that's not happening today. We're not getting that kind of top-down leadership, but in each of our communities in the US, and I'm sure this is true, you know, around the world, there's probably someone who's been resettled to our country sometime in the last, 2 to 5 years, or even in the last 6 months. Some people are coming, and given that the climate has never been less welcoming, there's always something you can do, whether an English lesson, a spare mattress, you name it. And so, again, not making the best the enemy of the good and the small and the meaningful. And here again, let's take inspiration from Ruben and Nubar and Vartan. These are individuals whose families were brutalized in such profound ways more than 100 years ago. And instead of, focusing narrowly on their families or their communities to harness the platforms that they have, and they're not solving every problem, but digging deep and saying, okay, what is a thing that we can do? We can't deal with the authoritarian cascade right now all at once, but what is it that we can do, and can we create kind of a ripple effect? And I think that's what they've done with this prize.
And of course, in your work at Harvard, you are teaching the next generation about global leaderships. And what are you saying to them? What is your message to them in the way that they can make a difference? As a final question to you.
Just two quick things, I guess I would say. One, a lot of young people now are incredibly activated, which is amazing. But often what they'll tell you is, the worst version of it is, I want to be UN ambassador, or I want to be US ambassador to the UN, what do I do? And I say, but why? What's the thing you want to do? Having the job is amazing, don't get me wrong, it's the best job I probably will ever have. But what do you want to use that for? And so what that amounts to, my message to them often is, know something about something. That we can't fight all the battles, but even to just say, I want to promote human rights, that's pretty abstract. Whose human rights? Where? How? And to try to just, again, go small rather than big, I think. And then the second thing I would say, which is a bit sensitive, is that they are overloaded and overstimulated because of the new technologies. And these tools that we all have can be incredible assets. But they, in the spirit of knowing something about something, they're also the enemy of reading a book. And listening to Vartan Gregorian, every time I listen to him, no matter what the subject, I just want to say, like, your head and your brain are like the same size as mine, but you manage to know everything about everything. Every subject known to man, how is it, and every language, basically, practically spoken on planet Earth. But that learning and that culture and the suppleness of the analytic mind that one gets when one goes deep is something that will really enhance the advocacy and the activism of these people who want to do the right thing, but going deep and taking the time and putting the gadgets away. Again, I'm sounding like an old crotchety.
Like a mother, actually.
Like a mother, exactly. But it really is it's an investment in the long game. And make no mistake, human rights, activism, the cause of human dignity is a long game.
So Samantha there drawing together, obviously, the enthusiasm of the young for change and implementing a difference on the ground, together with the wisdom of the more experienced in the humanitarian field. So Samantha, thank you very much indeed.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Now, on to the first part of the programme, where we're going to focus on empowerment through information, looking at how information can encourage people to act, how it's vital for building trust and empowering those affected by crises. Now, our conveners today know firsthand the importance of surveying an issue in order to most effectively take action, given their annual Aurora Humanitarian Index. It's a global survey that analyzes the public response and perception of humanitarian challenges and actions. This year, as you'll see on the map, 12 countries were surveyed with over 10,000 respondents. And here to introduce these findings and to take a look at the difference between the state of the world today and our perception of it is Dirk Jacobs, Professor of Sociology at the Université Libre de Bruxelles. Welcome, Dirk.
Thank you, Jane. It's an honor to be here. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I have the pleasure and the honor to present to you some of the highlights of the 2018 Aurora Humanitarian Index. It's an online survey undertaken in 12 countries across the globe. Data was collected by Edelman Intelligence with support of Kantar Public. And the research is focusing on attitudes towards humanitarian challenges with a particular focus on the situation of refugees. And as in the two earlier editions, terrorism was seen as the most pressing global humanitarian challenge in all participating countries. One of the most remarkable findings this year is that in most countries, the perception of the risk of war has risen significantly and is often seen as the second most pressing issue. Now, I would like to present to you some of the other findings, in particular with regard to the gap between perception and reality. And we will also be doing some interactive voting of our own. So I'm sorry, Samantha, we will be using a gadget here. You will all find on your seat or next to your seat a little white gadget with which you can vote. And I would like to collectively try the system out with you. And here you see a figure. There's a square with the letter A in it and a square with the letter B in it. And I would like you to make a choice and to push either the button 1 or the button 2 or the button 3. If you think that the darkest shade of gray is the square with the letter A or the square with the letter B, or if you think that both have equal shades, then you push number 3. So we would like to invite you to do this choice, to make this choice now. So I'll count down 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. If everyone has voted or has given it a try, then let us have a look at the results. Well, a majority of people thinks that it's A that has the darkest shade of gray. Well, actually, the correct answer is that they have an equal shade. And representing it in this way, putting a line between the two squares might help you to convince and to see this, but it's our brain tricking us. For me also, when I look at this, I see the A as being the darkest shade of gray. So what we think is reality, our mind can be influenced by what we want to see and not necessarily what is in reality there. Now let's go on to a question which is present in the humanitarian index. And I would like you to once more take a vote based on what you know. Which of these countries has accepted the highest number of refugees over the last decade? And there you can make a choice. So 1 if you think it's Germany, 2 for Lebanon, 3 for Uganda, 4 for France, 5 for Pakistan, 6 for the United States of America, 7 for Turkey, or 8 for Iran. Thank you for participating and making a choice now of pushing 1. So what country has hosted most refugees as a whole? As a whole, in general. So let's look at the numbers here, and well, it's runners-up. People either think that it's Germany or that it's in Turkey. Well, reality actually is that the country that is hosting most refugees is Turkey. You can see this on the right-hand side of the slide. Turkey is hosting 3 million refugees, followed by other countries with substantial numbers of refugees, Pakistan and Lebanon, more than 1 million refugees. Now, the perception of people is totally different. If in our survey, most people have actually chosen Germany, have indicated Germany as being the country hosting most refugees. Well, they actually only come in place 8. Most people have the idea that it are Western countries that host most refugees. Well, this is not true. Now, another question that was asked was the following one. There are too many humanitarian crises to keep up with in the world today, and there, again, let us do the interactive voting. If you agree with this statement, then you push number 1. If you disagree with this statement, then you push number 2. So we got all the hang of it now, so let's immediately look at the results. Well, it's a split vote here, but it seems to be that quite some people in the audience indeed feel that there's a crisis overload, and this corresponds pretty much with the results in the humanitarian survey, where there are obviously a lot of variations between countries, but an overall majority in most countries has this subjective feeling that there's a crisis overload. Now, and that has a negative consequence, because the result of that is that sizable groups of people have no knowledge or limited knowledge on major humanitarian crises like the ones going on with the Rohingya in Myanmar, or the situation in the Congo, in South Sudan, or in Yemen. Now, let us now focus on the willingness to help refugees. Obviously, there are some differences from country to country, and I'll come back to this, but in most countries, the most frequent form of support that is being given, notably to refugees, is donating goods, 51% globally, or supporting a charity, 39%. Now, we could discuss whether the glass is half full or half empty, but if we focus now on the willingness to help, an overall majority in all countries is willing to donate goods or support charities. And even a substantial minority of over 20% of people would be willing to offer accommodation or shelter refugees at their home. Now, if we do the same, if we do some analysis for what are the drivers for action or drivers for inaction in helping out refugees, we can see a number of things. First of all, if we look at what people report themselves, what are their subjective reasons for helping out or not helping out, we can see that people who want to act want to make a difference in someone's life. Right? They say that they feel they have the responsibility to do something. They feel fortunate that they're able to help, and they can imagine that it might happen to them and then would like to have be helped out. Those who do not want to help out say either that they cannot afford to give help, or are skeptical about how money will be spent, or think that their actions would not reach the refugees. Now, if we analyze a bit deeper beyond these justifications that people give themselves, we can see that higher educated people and younger people have the tendency to be willing to help out more and to help out more. While on the other hand, people who feel economically or culturally threatened by migrants are less likely to be willing to help. And at this point, I should talk about the elephant in the room, as a considerable part of these people who feel economically or culturally threatened by migrants not only do not wish refugees to come to their countries, are less inclined and less willing to help them in their countries, but also do not wish to help them abroad, in the areas where they are suffering. So these are indications that part of the problem is actually linked to xenophobia and racism. And in numerous countries, we've seen that populist politicians have been trying to enhance these sentiments or have tapped into these negative sentiments. And as you might know, currently in a number of European countries, actually showing solidarity with refugees is currently being criminalized. Now, what is analytically also striking is that over and beyond individual drivers, in richer countries, there is less willingness to help than in poorer countries. And it are those who feel economically and culturally threatened by migrants in the richer countries that are the least likely to want to show solidarity to refugees. So this amounts pretty much to partially being a moral crisis, actually. Now, fully acknowledging that migrants can put a strain on society, especially in countries like Turkey hosting 3 million refugees or Lebanon hosting 1 million refugees, which is a quarter of its population. Public opinion in other countries seems to be insufficiently appreciating the positive impact migration can have on society and on the economy. There are often misconceptions. And interestingly, these misconceptions are often particularly outspoken where there are less migrants in a region, especially in the developed world. Now, in the richer world. Let me illustrate this with this chart, showing some data from different states in the United States of America. And on the horizontal axis, you will have the percentage of new immigrants arriving in the last 5 years. And the more to the right, a ball is to be found, the circle is to be found, more immigrants there are. The more to the left, the little dot is less immigrants there are. On the vertical axis, we have the proportion of people who think that undocumented people commit more crime. The higher the points are to be found, the higher the percentage of people who think that this is the case. Now, we know that undocumented migrants do not commit more crime. They actually commit less crime. But in those states with few new migrants, a large proportion of people believe the contrary. While in states with more migrants, a more realistic perception is present. It's when there's few migrants that there's more mistakes being made. You see, people want to believe that the A square is the darkest one, because this is the associations that they make. Now, let us do a last collective vote using the gadget, because we have no time to read a book here. What proportion of refugees do you believe are children under the age of 18? And you have to make a choice between these different suggestions. Posted on the screen, and I'll give a little hint. The world population, 31% of the world population are children. So if you now make a choice of these different options, and let's see what the audience thinks on this topic, if we have the results ready. Well, you're a very well-informed audience in general, I have to speak, because the most chosen option is the correct answer. 51% of all refugees are children. This is something that people don't know in the Humanitarian Index. The average estimate that was made was 32%, while half of refugees are children in reality. Now, interesting to see is that the index also revealed that people are more inclined to help when they know that children are affected. So perhaps this is something that should be stressed in information with regard to the refugee crisis. Now, I'm at the same time also a bit reluctant to advise NGOs and campaigners to focus too much on children, as then one might run into the risk of focusing too much on the idea of meriting or deserving victims, while the central element of providing humanitarian aid should also be that you do not make distinctions on this basis. So that might be a message that backfires. Now, overall, and despite some scandals that were revealed just before the polling period, majority of people applauds the positive impact of NGOs and has trust in the work done by NGOs in the field. And also interesting, and I will end on that note, people appreciate hearing testimonies about people on the ground, testimonies from refugees, and hearing stories about people delivering humanitarian aid. So I would say that this is one of the findings of the Aurora Humanitarian Index that stresses the importance of the actions undertaken by the Aurora Prize through its Gratitude in Action program. And now I would like to invite you to have a look at a small video animation that presents some of the other highlights of the Aurora Humanitarian Index.
The Aurora Humanitarian Initiative, created on behalf of the survivors of the Armenian genocide and in gratitude to their saviors, explores the realities and perceptions about humanitarian challenges and responsibilities around the world every year by asking these questions. How do people see the world's most pressing humanitarian challenges today? What do the publics in different countries think about their role in these challenges? How are they affected? What can they do about them? Do these responses change over time? Aurora believes we all need answers to these questions in order to better design effective responses and impact lives. The Aurora Humanitarian Index has asked these and other questions for 3 consecutive years and in 12 countries. This year, as in years past, people around the world are most worried about terrorism, although that concern is receding. Instead, fears over the risk of war have grown significantly. People in Russia, Armenia, and Turkey are the ones most worried about war. The highest increase in the concern over war was registered in the UK, Russia, Germany, and Turkey. Moreover, more than half of those surveyed see war or the risk of war as the #1 reason that people are fleeing their homes. The number of people displaced as a result of conflict and violence has nearly doubled since 2000 and has increased sharply over the last 5 years. By the end of 2016, 40.3 million people were internally displaced because of conflict and violence in the world. More than half of those surveyed think the war in Syria is the #1 cause of global displacement. Which countries accept the most refugees? People still think it's Western countries, led by Germany, while in reality, the top 3 countries hosting the most refugees in 2017 are Turkey, Pakistan, and Lebanon. People feel overwhelmed by the humanitarian crises across the globe. 61% of the respondents said there are too many crises to follow. Perhaps that is the reason why so many underestimate the enormous damage to children. More than half of the total refugee population is children, but the perception among the majority of those surveyed is that barely 1/3 of refugees are children. At the same time, half of respondents say they would feel more compelled to act on a humanitarian issue if they knew it affected children. People feel divided on whether more should be done to help refugees. 1 in 2 respondents thinks refugees deserve more help than what they're currently getting, while at the same time, half say their country has already taken in too many refugees, and just 1/3 feel their country has not done enough. A trust gap blocks the public's willingness to support the international community. 79% of respondents see the international community as most capable to address the global refugee crisis, whereas only 50% trust them to provide the right level or type of humanitarian aid to help address the crisis. But 65% of respondents agree that the situation would be far worse if it were not for the efforts of NGOs. 3/4 of those surveyed believe NGO transparency and accountability is critical. On the list of international figures most capable of addressing the refugee crisis, there is no consensus. Angela Merkel is highest with 46%, with Donald Trump close behind. Vladimir Putin, Pope Francis, and UN Secretary General Guterres are selected by about 1/3 of respondents. Business leaders are viewed as equally capable. The 2 names most cited in all countries are Bill Gates and Mark Zuckerberg. Finally, the low levels of trust in sources of information has not changed. Just over half of respondents trust television, friends, newspapers, and magazines. About the same number trust information from NGOs and international media outlets. Other sources, governments, the internet, are trusted less. There is also a desire for more diverse and positive coverage of the global refugee crisis. News coverage is too much about the consequences of displacement as opposed to root causes, according to 3 of 5 respondents. Almost as many think coverage should be more inspiring and positive. In the context of such often contradictory feelings, it is not surprising that people's willingness to help is conditional. 2 out of 5 want to know if it would really make a difference. Half say they would give if they knew it helped children.
Thank you very much, Dirk, for that very interesting presentation. And to draw out some of those surprising findings from the index, perception versus reality, who people trust, and how information can empower to bring about change, I'd like to welcome the first panel. First, Bernard Kouchner, co-founder of Médecins Sans Frontières, the former French foreign minister and former minister of health. He's also an Aurora Prize Selection Committee member. Welcome, Bernard. Would you like to sit here? Perhaps you just click on your microphone on the thing. Preeti Nalu, who is the founding editor of Refugees Deeply and has worked in many countries around the world with refugees. Preeti, would you like to sit next to Bernard and to switch on your microphone? And then we've got Ruben Vardanyan, who, of course, as you all know, is a co-founder of the Aurora Humanitarian Initiative and also an impact investor and social entrepreneur. Welcome, Ruben. And Ernesto Zedillo, director of the Center for the Study of Globalization at Yale, former president of Mexico, also an Aurora Prize Selection Committee member. Could I ask you just to make sure your mics are roughly at the level where we can hear you all? That's right, and stay close to the mics. Everybody happy? Now, I'd like to kick off, really, by asking all of you in turn, quite briefly, to say what surprised or perhaps shocked you in the findings of the index. Preeti.
Well, I have to say I was surprised to see the number 51% for children, and interestingly, we're about to see a video in a bit where I do show the profile of an Afghan internally displaced boy, and it's a really good example of the myopia you can develop when you, I think I'm the only one who's concerned with underage refugees, and hence it's amplified in my head, but the numbers...
So that was surprising to you?
Yeah, they've definitely
We'll
gone
take
up
a look
in
at the
past
video
years.
later on. I'd just like to get round. Bernard, what surprised and shocked you, perhaps, in the findings of the index?
Well, you didn't compare the number of accepted refugees to the population. Because if you had, Lebanon was the winner. 2 million, 2 to 3 million inhabitants, then close to 2 million of refugees.
Yes, Lebanon.
But they didn't accept these people as refugees. They are not living in camp under the UNHCR's auspices. So there's a difference. But what is, if I may, was shocking for me, my country didn't accept refugees. And my country is a Mediterranean country. Our children are playing on the beaches of this Mediterranean Sea, and we didn't accept practically not enough.
Ruben.
I don't want to repeat what already was said. Another aspect that surprised me about the people who've been chosen who can most influential to from the business or from political side for this refugee crisis. It's really amazing to see how people are not realizing who is really doing what and how they are involved in all this. I think it's a perception reality was some mismatch, which was clearly showing people have no clue what's going on.
Ernesto.
Well, after what has happened since the end of 2016, almost nothing surprises me. So I was not surprised. Actually, given what I have seen, yeah, this is business as usual.
But did anything...
There's a big gap between facts and attitudes. I think the relevant question, which I hope we will explore in this panel, is why is this happening?
Bernard, why is this happening?
Depends what. I mean, of course, we didn't do anything, or close to, facing the Syrian crisis. And the Syrian crisis, just the numbers were, you know, we have now news channel. So how many? 50, 100 new channels devoted to one event a day. And it was a routine for Syria. Syria, well, today, 10,000 more dead person, 10,000 more dying in the sea, etc. It doesn't mean anything anymore. Because I was very interested by what you propose us to understand with your numbers and pushing the button. But we are not to push the button one after one. The crisis concerned people dying with their children, with their grandmother, with their wheelchair. And it was absolutely, well, no, sorry. I remember when it was the boat people in the China Sea. It was so far, 12,000 kilometers. And my country sent 7 boats to rescue them. And in the Mediterranean Sea, no boat. Some rescue boat from Médecins Sans Frontières, Médecins du Monde, etc. Because there is a compassion fatigue and a sort of new wave, not only of nationalism. We have to talk politics, but also of racism. And why did we do nothing or turn the head? Because these people in the Mediterranean Sea were Muslim.
Preeti, I mean, we're talking here about information overload, that's what Bernard's referring to, and compassion fatigue. How do you see that in the world in which you work, in the refugee world in particular?
Well, in terms of the field, I noticed that so much information is thrown at us at such a rapid rate that we're often reducing very complex narratives and experiences into digestible content. So we're creating black and white narratives that simply do not start the conversations that can help a lot of people at the heart of displacement in rehabilitating their communities. So while modern journalism has much diversity, it's lacking in depth. That's the main thing. And the other part being that we're still not fully comprehending the fact that when people are displaced, like in Syria, they are displaced several times within their country before they cross the borders. And they cross the borders and they opt for culturally intimate settings like Lebanon or Jordan. And it's really a last resort. It is symptomatic of international political failure that they're going as far as they are today.
Ernesto, you talk about the need for change and on the political front, and that you're not surprised because the rise of certain right-wing governments. You know, what can politicians do when you look at these findings and you see that 40% of the population believes that immigrants are a threat to their livelihood and to their jobs, to the state around them? What can politicians do to change that?
Well, I think politicians are part of the problem, and of course also part of the solution. There's the old fascist maxim, you just have to repeat a lie over and over again until it becomes an absolute truth. And what we have heard over the last few years is that trade is bad, migration is bad, that the Chinese are a threat, always blaming the others for whatever ill is happening in the world. And unfortunately, I think we have two kinds of people, people who will listen, and eventually become convinced that that is true. And then there are some people who were in the closet with certain values, certain attitudes that had become not politically correct, so they wouldn't be outspoken about it. Now that they hear some political leaders to say things that they have deep in their beliefs and in their heart, well, they come out and become extremely supportive. So I think we have a reinforcement of attitudes that has been motivated to a great extent by some political leaders, and they are being terribly successful.
Ruben, do you think that what we have is a moral crisis here? I mean, Dirk referred to that, what some of the figures show. I mean, people not even recognizing that more than half the refugee population are children.
Yeah, we definitely have a moral crisis. One thing that we found when we started Aurora, I went to 20 countries and tried to talk about our project when we started. In every country, I asked one question: who's your moral leader? Not the political, not the business person. And you know, it was amazing, shocking for me what I found. Most of the country, people cannot name it the moral leaders. I think it's a significant challenge we're facing, because in the 20th century, after the Second World War, it was clearly writers, philosophers, the peace. Again, it was people who really been important for society disappeared. We are facing something significant, I will say, crisis internal from the societies where people will lose this very important segment of the people who people trust and follow because of their moral values, not because of their titles.
So you're talking about leadership when it comes to morality. And Preeti, I mean, surprisingly, NGOs, yes, they're still supported by the findings of the index, more than 60%. But there's also a large percentage of people who believe that multinationals should enter into the fray to solve problems. We've got names like Angela Merkel, not surprisingly, but a bit more surprisingly, President Trump. And we've also got business leaders like Mark Zuckerberg and Bill Gates mentioned. And that's what the public think. What's your reaction to that?
Well, the reaction would be very much mixed. I mean, there is an existing industry built around the refugee crisis across the globe. There are a lot of industries benefiting from, you know, those who provide tarpaulin tents to food. So there is an industry built around it. So I don't really see it being, I wouldn't be too skeptical about inviting multinationals, but I think this is where the information network, the nexus between the researchers and the humanitarian actors and media must be really strong so that we can actually be the ones who play the sort of role of the minders, who make sure that what the multinationals are doing are based on corroborated facts and that they actually lead to policy that is pragmatic, informed, and thoughtful at the highest levels.
So Bernard, I mean, you led one of the most well-known humanitarian organizations, Médecins Sans Frontières. What do you think about the findings that seem to suggest that the public puts more faith perhaps in business leaders these days than in politicians and even in NGOs?
I don't think so.
I think
well, this is worse than that. This is because, well, asking what about the politician? What did they do, etc. Politicians are elected in some democratic countries, yes? Well, and if they want to propose in their program, will help refugees, are you in agreement? They will not be elected. That's for sure, completely, and mainly because of nationalism. I'll give you a good example of a regroupment of strengths. European Union. It is exactly the model to accept with human base, I mean, sort of an answer to this crisis of the refugees. On the contrary, European Union, worse and worse every day, they are not accepting and they are banning the refugees. Why? Europe is a sort of, let's say, normal continent with a certain level of democracy. Look, we proposed at the 27, in that time we were 27, at the 27 to accept together, to share the burden. It was nothing at the beginning. They refused. And thanks to Madame Merkel, she saved the honor of Europe. Unfortunately, at a real high cost, because in now the Bundestag, there is close to 100 fascists. This is the reality, political reality. And not only that, but a sort of, by advance, they are straightened. The fear is very high. But as you said in your index, I mean, the refugees are not criminals. This is absolutely not true, on the contrary. But, well, this is partly the responsibility of the media, but this is also heavily the responsibility of the politician. We were all running to extreme rightist people and to extreme nationalist people because we didn't want to lose the power.
Ernesto, you spoke about the responsibility of politicians, but what about the media? Because obviously that is the way the message gets out, and we heard from the index that the audience and the public want more personal stories of refugees. They want the media to tell them what's happening out there, to empower them to make decisions. What about information flows in the media?
Well, first, we will have to discuss what do we mean by media today. Because before we thought about TV and newspapers, and we know now that that world is much more complex. So I have a little bit of a different idea. I think posing the question about media or information or saying that people receive too much or that is a little bit too naive. And to make the point, you know, maybe I should go to one of my early morning esoteric readings today. I was reading an article in Science magazine that was published just yesterday or the day before yesterday. And first I was intrigued because this stems from evolutionary game theory. It's theory of critical mass. And at the beginning I was all excited. It says minority groups can start social change towards new social conventions. This is the result of this experiment. When minority groups reach the critical mass, they can overturn the established behavior. Say, bravo, you know, now I finally can get drug policy to change or nuclear weapons to be wiped out. And so I kept reading these things, and I was all excited. And suddenly I said, oh, I went back to the future, 2011, when people were all excited about Twitter and Facebook, and I was terribly scared about that, perhaps of my age. But anyways, and I'm equally scared about these results, because they say when you have a critical mass of something like 30%, then you can make the whole society shift towards a new order. And you know what? The reactionaries, the nationalists, the populists, the xenophobics are right there. You go country after country. They have had a strategy exactly using this kind of analysis. And they are getting close to the point to create a critical mass that could change a lot of values, a lot of attitudes, a lot of behaviors that we thought were here to stay. It is, for me, shocking to recognize that after 18 months of incredible things happening in the United States, we still see a level of support for Donald Trump that very much approaches this critical mass. So I just want to know when a tipping point is going to happen, but a tipping point in the wrong direction, which will be a disaster for that country, and I think it will be a disaster for humanity.
I'm sure we could talk about that all day, but I'm going to pull it back to the index here, because Ruben, you've been carrying out this research now for a couple of years. Do you notice any fundamental shifts in the findings this year? Because after all, we have so many wars, we have so many global crises going on at the moment.
No, I think it's index just confirming, and it was really what we did. We especially took the countries with different mentality, different religion, different geographic, trying to see is any culture difference or any big difference. You can see some of the difference, like in perceptions about in Russia and in Iran can be different compared to Kenya. And you can see, I think, some of the elements which, but it's not significant. Most of them showing the trend is same. People scare about future, people scare about what's going on, they don't trust, and they won't trying to ignore all the problems. I think we're facing a step of the real serious crisis of the system crisis, because people really lost the trust of the system, in my opinion.
And Preeti, we saw, didn't we, the gap between reality and perception and reality as to which countries actually have the largest refugee populations. You've got Turkey up there, but also Lebanon, which particularly has taken a lot of the Armenian refugees from Syria. And I think it's a million refugees taken in by a very small country. And of course, Pakistan comes third. Now, these are areas, Pakistan, you've worked in. What's your reflection there about how these countries are they're not given credit for the work that they do and the way that they do absorb refugees, and often not just in camps, but allowing them to work and really integrating them into their societies?
And also to add that Lebanon has some of the best assimilated Armenian communities.
It does already,
and
yeah.
that's been happening for a while now. It's interesting that we live in an age of unprecedented access to media, but one of the things that did surprise me about the index that I should have thought about earlier was I was never surprised growing up in India and knowing that it is in the so-called global south that most of the displaced live. This was not news to me. So what actually surprises me is that so many people are surprised that it is Lebanon, it is Turkey, because it is these societies and countries that have that flexibility to adapt to changing realities that have been traditionally the hosts. So we do need to kind of fill this gap, and we also need to show that a lot of these countries are very resilient. A lot of the European funding has not gone through, and it has decreased over the years, yet they are devising new ways of helping those refugees who will be staying there for a while. There is a lot of anti-refugee sentiment, this is true, but there are also a lot of programs that are working. And so I think we need to think a little bit more about what has worked in a certain community in Lebanon, and how can that be scaled to size?
Yeah, that's an answer to how can we do practical, how can we help for practical answers to bring about change. Bernard, obviously, one of the things that didn't surprise people in this room who were very well informed was that 51% of refugees are children, although the perception is it's only a third. That's the bad news, perhaps, that there is such a big gap. But the good news is that when people learn that so many children are refugees, they do want to help them. What are your reflections on that? We can use that fact, can't we? The fact that people have sympathy with children.
How to use it? How to use it when your country is closing the border? Sorry, but you cannot just change the policy like that. Yes, compassion is out. It was just for me, my generation, sorry. But ununderstandable to see the coming back of fascism. Fascism, not the word like you say when you're not talking about. No. I mean, look at extreme rightist people. They don't want at all one refugee. They believe that not only they are taking the job, which is untrue, but they are a threat. They are a threat in itself. They are the threat because they are Muslim, etc., etc. In fact, what are we supposed to do? What about demography? What about sort of different attitude facing what we call globalization? We have to talk about the reality. The number of people on the earth, the difference now between the rich and the poor, the difference in between the so-called richness of Europe, and also the way Mr. Trump is acting. So this is a sort of very ununderstandable complexity. Why? Because the only very false base reason because we are a very dark future, they are all taking refugees as a pretext. And look what happened in Brexit in England. Refugees, but they are not coming. Well, and what happened in between Italy? In Italy, what about the Dublin Agreement? We are not talking about that because the politicians are scared by this perspective.
So I'd like to draw it to a conclusion, really, by asking each of you, how can things be changed? Who can change it? Briefly, I know that's a very big question, but given the findings of the index, what would you say, Ernesto?
Well, I think we have to stop being naive and recognize that those forces that want to force humanity into a regression, they do have an intelligent strategy, and we don't, you know, and we don't. And we need to have causes, very specific causes, and to be decisive and committed to those very specific causes. Not only talk about ideals and morals and all of that, which is very important. Let us take for granted our common values, and then let's have strategies to make people aware of the facts, not of the fake news and all of that.
Ruben.
So we have to embrace particular causes that will make a difference and then be active.
Ruben, what do you think?
You know, I was born in the Soviet Union, and I remember 1982 when Brezhnev died. We've been living okay life, but it was clear for the system it will not support our nation anymore, and people lost the confidence about the future. Which means, doesn't matter what we were saying, the system will be reshuffled and restructured and redesigned. This is why I don't see any chance what is happening today with the same signal. The world facing under significant transformation shift, which will happen anyway. Now, it will happen like in Gorbachev and destroying the Soviet Union, or will it happen like in China with Deng Xiaoping to moderating, or will go by more like Yugoslavia with the war. It's a question for all of us, and we need to be actively engaged. Otherwise, it will go worst case scenario, because clearly people not trust the system, people scared about future, people becoming nationalistic and populistic and isolated because of the scariness. So I talk about change of perception. It's one of the key elements to talk about this publicly, loudly. That's why we're doing this Aurora, why we're trying to bring human values back. We're living in a secularized society, whereas people lost the religion belief. Values becoming key element of the. In Armenia, you are today in Armenia, whereas the crisis was not about political, it was moral crisis. The prime minister resigned, not because of the something was opposition wrong, right? Because people said we don't accept what you lie us.
Bernard, what can we do to change things briefly? Sorry.
Briefly, nothing.
Be a little more optimistic.
On the contrary, I believe that it will be worse. No, but
Briefly.
we have to. Briefly, I don't know.
You don't know?
No, because there is no recipe, a miracle. No, it's over this time. We have to think about how can we survive in living together, how can we reinforce solidarity. Fraternity and solidarity have empty words right now. I'm talking about European Union, not all the world. But believe me, it was impossible in France, the country of so-called country of human rights, just to accept a massacre like in Syria, with no demonstration in the street, with nothing. Another time, 10,000. So I cannot say that it was a sort of fantastic help to the people. No. We have to change the whole picture.
Preeti.
Allow me to play the idealist card here. I think every one of us present here are part of a very complex media research humanitarian policy index, nexus, or matrix, if you will. We just need to strengthen that. We need to be more collaborative versus competitive within our sectors and across sectors. And we need to use each other in terms of places with restricted access like Syria, Yemen, and Libya. Otherwise, we risk creating memory gaps in the discourse, and we've seen the devastating effects of that.
Well, thank you to the panel. I mean, they've led us through strategy and leadership. They've talked about changing perceptions, collaboration, not competition, and a more pessimistic view here from Bernard. But I'd like to thank all the panelists, Preeti, Bernard, Ruben, and Ernesto. Thank you.